What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you've dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. But they were of a different kind, the names that stilled your childish play. They have gone about the world like wind, but little time had they to pray, for whom the hangman's rope was spun, and what, God help us, could they save? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Was it for this the wild geese spread, the grey wing upon every tide? Was it for this all that blood was shed? Was it for this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone? All that delirium of the brave? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet could we turn the years again and call those exiles as they were, in all their loneliness and pain, you'd cry, some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. They weighed so lightly what they gave. But let them be. They're dead and gone. They're with O'Leary in the grave. Not my words, friends, if only. I wish. The words of William Butler Yeats in his poem September 1913. Iconic poem, fantastic poem, a poem that has lived throughout the ages, a poem full of spite, a poem full of complicated emotions, which I'm going to go into right now. It's written as an address, it's titled almost like a diary entry. Yeats wasn't really in the business of writing prosaic diary entries anyway. He was in the business of writing dramatic and romantic, with a capital R, poems. So September 1913, this was a very heightened time in Irish history. It was the start of a 10-year period, generally known as the Revolutionary period. You could kind of bookend it with the 1913 lockout, which I'm going to go into in a second, and the Civil War, which ended in 1923. In between both of those, you had the 1916 Rising, you had the rise of the Irish Volunteers, a paramilitary force, a revolutionary force, I suppose. And then you had the Irish Independence War, and then the very, very bloody, very, very factional Civil War. So Yeats is drawing on a few different strands of what's going on. There's three, I suppose, main things that's going on, three main things he's trying to address in this poem, funneled into a quite condensed poem. First one of those is the 1913 lockout. This was a huge 5-month period of industrial unrest. It involved 20,000 workers, basically led by a Mr. Jim Larkin. A lot of the workers of the city wanted to unionise. They had a few different demands, but the main thing was the demand to join a union. The major employers of the day decided that this was put the frighteners on them, essentially, and they decided as a preemptive move that they would lock the workers out of the premises. Any worker who wanted to unionise, sorry, that was a little bit of a burp there, any worker who wanted to unionise was not allowed back into their workplaces. It was led by a set of very influential business people for the time, none more influential than a certain Mr. William Martin Murphy, who is kind of the direct person Yeats is addressing in his scorn and his desperate words and his kind of dramatised hopelessness in this poem. So Murphy was a very influential business person. He was a Catholic as well, so kind of unusual for the time for somebody to be so wealthy as a Catholic in Ireland. He was maybe what we'd call today like a press baron. He owned 4 of the major newspapers in the country at the time. He was, among many other things, he was the chairman of the Dublin Tramway Company. So he kind of had a stranglehold on public opinion and the way people got around. A lot of fingers and a lot of pies, and a lot of influential fingers in certain very influential pies. Probably kind of stumbling over that metaphor there, aren't I? So the 1913 lockout, most people would say, unfortunately ended in a defeat for the workers. They were kind of like starved and economically beaten down by this lockout, and after 5 months they decided to return to their workplaces. Anybody who was considered to be a leader of the workers during this time wasn't allowed at all, were banned from going back to pretty much most of the jobs in the city. Yeats viewed this as an incredibly short-sighted, petty, in the words, I'm going to read the poem again in a few minutes, an incredibly petty, self-interested, materialistic conceptualization of self. Yeats, by contrast, had, I think it's fair to say, quite a fantastical, idealistic, potentially completely unrealistic view of what constituted an Irish citizen. He was very interested in the ancient world, in folklore around the campfire, and he came from far from humble beginnings himself. So it's kind of interesting and adds to the complexity that Yeats considers himself the person who is worthy of speaking on behalf of the people on matters as complex as the soul of the nation and where the country is going and what kind of birth Ireland should have and what character that should have. So yeah, Yeats hated, despised Murphy for his what he viewed as his unfair and economic self-interest in depriving so many working people of quite a basic right in terms of their ability to work and their ability to sell their own labour. Another thing that was going on, which was probably dearer to Yeats's heart, was the potential establishment of a modern art gallery in the city. There was a gentleman called Hugh Lane who had amassed a huge amount of fantastic modern art during a time of the late 19th, early 20th century avant-garde. He had a keen eye as a collector. He had a brilliant collection of Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, all that jazz, all that kind of revolutionary stuff in an artistic sense. He wanted to donate this collection to the city of Dublin and to the people of Ireland by extension. All he really asked for was that a venue might be provided, a building would be provided where he could house this lovely collection. It's kind of interesting, the original plans for this building which had been drawn up was a bridge building structure across the River Liffey. If you're familiar with the Rialto Bridge in Venice, it was kind of a copy of that. But if you've ever been to Venice and seen the Rialto Bridge, it's not a half bad thing to copy. So it would have been pretty cool for the city. Would have maybe destroyed a lot of the fantastic views going down the river, but that's apocryphal. That's something people can toss over. And the city now has a modern art collection, municipal collection. It's known as the Hugh Lane Gallery. So kind of got his way in the end. But at the time, there was a huge big newspaper campaign against modern art, against the idea that Ireland was a worthy place to house modern art. It was spearheaded by William Martin Murphy through his newspapers, and Yeats, I suppose, viewed Murphy as a very kind of opposed to intellectualism, I suppose, is maybe how Yeats would have viewed it. He had his own personal views that were very against modern art, and Yeats viewed Murphy as a really hypocritical figure because Murphy was one of the wealthiest self-made, kind of in a sense, let's just say, one of the wealthiest independent business people in the entire country, and he was arguing that housing a modern art gallery in Dublin would cost too much money, and that's too much for Ireland to aspire to as a poor nation among all the nations in the world. Yeats wanted Ireland to assume a standard of excellence on the world stage. Yeats had kind of highfalutin notions, it really has to be said, but I think it's also fair to say that what he was going for here in terms of that Ireland, in order to be a nation, needed also to be a nation where it was open to avant-garde ideas, open-minded to international ideas, while also maintaining a unique character of self and a unique soul to its sense of nationhood. All very complex stuff, everything like that. The long and short of it is that Murphy had a big campaign, said no, no, no to the Hugh Lane Gallery, and he got his way at the time. Public opinion completely soured on this idea of a municipal art gallery, a gallery of modern art, and Yeats was on the receiving end of a huge amount of this public scorn and opprobrium and all that stuff. So Yeats was really demoralised and felt very exposed by having put this idea forward and for it to be smacked back in his face as he saw it. A final thing that Yeats is drawing on here, and it's really evident in the refrain in this poem, "Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave." It doesn't get more dramatic than that. It's a really fucking dramatic line, isn't it? O'Leary, who he's referring to, is a Mr. John O'Leary, who's a really interesting character. He's quite obscure today compared to a lot of household name revolutionary figures, which Yeats mentions in the poem, the likes of Edward Fitzgerald, Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet. Those will be still talking about all the time. John O'Leary has a little bit fallen by the wayside in terms of what people talk about in terms of Irish history. He was kind of really a man after Yeats's own heart. He was, you could say, also a romantic in the capital R sense. He was a mid-19th century revolutionary leader. He had very idealistic views. He wanted Ireland to have full separation from Britain, which wasn't really too much of a conventional view at that time, mid-19th century, only a few decades after the famine. He also was not really too much of a talker as well. He tried to lead a revolution, didn't really pan out too well. This was a time in Europe when there was revolutions of the people that were like wildfire all across the European continent. So O'Leary was a very cultured figure, a very learned figure. He had a fantastic beard, by the way. Give him a Google on your Google machine. Just look John O'Leary, Irish revolutionist. Lovely beard to him. So yeah, he wanted to create this completely distinct Irish identity that would be separate from Britain, and he was very concerned that the way Ireland was going, that by being too demoralised after the Great Famine and by seeking too many compromise options, that it would only ever be a kind of satellite quasi-nation of the empire. He was really, really kind of tapping into something that kind of did end up coming to pass in the idealism of the Easter Rising of 1916. So just to kind of sum up, or to kind of finish up, Yeats, he's kind of writing in this really kind of hopeless tone in it. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. But I think that's maybe what's so interesting about it, is Yeats kind of doesn't even really believe his own words. What he's putting forward is a tone of hopelessness. Maybe he's actually trying to present a sense of hopelessness as a way to reinvigorate the Irish revolutionary spirit, to invoke, it's kind of like an invocation address. He's kind of saying all has been lost. We're in the hands of the likes of Martin Murphy. We have to kind of accept that all these lovely, fantastical, inspiring figures of the past are just inspiring historical figures, and we have to accept our lot, and we're going to have to kowtow, and we're going to have to fit in with the general status quo and all those lovely folklore around the campfire. Well, that was just a nice idea. He doesn't really believe it though, is my opinion. So there's a lot of different questions going on at the end of it. There's a huge amount of spite that Yeats is pouring into it. There's a huge amount of idealism that Yeats is pouring into it, and he's sort of trying to use his power of words, and he had a fantastic power of words, as kind of big basin full of cold water that he was going to publish, and he was going to whoosh that into the face of ordinary working people, of people who are inclined towards revolution, and kind of say, was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? Was it for this all that blood was shed? Was it for fucking this? Do you want your fucking William Martin Murphys to be running the show, or do you want your John O'Learys to be running the show? And here I am, W.B. Yeats, I can't believe I said that wrong, W.B. Yeats, and I'm just essentially a toff, but I have a really cool pen, and I can use that pen. It's pretty fucking strong. I can't handle a sword, but I have a pen. I'm going to write this thing. Maybe that might spur on a bit of soul searching in the concept of revolution in Ireland. And 3 years later, the 1916 Rising happened. It would be way too much of a stretch to say that Yeats was, I can't believe I said that wrong again, that Yeats was instrumental in kind of generating the dramatic sacrifice that ended up happening in 1916. But I also think, or maybe it's something to kind of throw out as an open question, did this have quite a significant effect? This kind of tone of hopelessness, this kind of tone that Ireland was spiritually dead, did this have a sort of cold water basin effect on wrestling people into going, holy fucking shit, we don't want that. We're gonna fucking die for this shit. And it's gonna be hopeless, and it's gonna be idealistic, but it's gonna spur something that the next generation might take on board. So there's a lot of questions going on in this poem. I'm going to finish up with one more rendition of September 1960. Motherfucker. September 1913 by William Butler Yeats. What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and the prayer to shivering prayer, until you've dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet they were of a different kind, the names that stilled your childish play. They have gone about the world like wind, but little time had they to pray, for whom the hangman's rope was spun. And what, God help us, could they save? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? Was it for this all that blood was shed? Was it for this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone, all that delirium of the brave? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet could we turn the years again and call those exiles as they were, in all their loneliness and pain? You'd cry, William Martin Murphy, you'd cry, some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. But they weighed so lightly what they gave. But let them be. They're dead and gone. They're with O'Leary in the grave.